Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Google Pixel 3 XL and see how this specific phone holds up in 2022. Now what I'm definitely going to tell you is that the Pixel 3 XL is a very interesting device. It's not necessarily, a horrible deal. It's not a bad phone by any means, but it is a device that could have been a little bit better when it first came out. And I do think the software is great, the build quality is alright, but the design of this phone really dates this thing, and it's kind of embarrassing that Google would even make a phone like this that looked like this even in 2018. Now this phone is approaching 4 years old this year, and to rewind some time, the Pixel 2 and the Pixel 2 XL in my opinion were very solid looking phones. They looked great, they didn't really look ugly, and at that time in 2017 they looked up to par of what a lot of other phones were looking at that time. And I actually love the design of the Pixel 2 XL and it still looks great. However, on the Pixel 3 XL, there were a lot of leaks about what the notch of this thing was going to look like, of what the bottom bar was going to look like too, and it was honestly pretty embarrassing. I could not believe Google was actually thinking about doing something like this, and then they announced this thing, and Google actually just kind of dropped the ball on everybody, and I could not believe that the design of this thing was actually what it was. Now in 2018, it was 4 years ago, but if you guys remember, there was still a lot of phones back at that time that looked pretty beautiful. We had the Samsung Galaxy S9 that came out that year. We had the iPhone XS, XR, and XS Max that came out at that year as well. And I think we had some other phones too, like the OnePlus devices at that time. But that doesn't disclude the fact that Google made the Pixel 3 almost the same type of design as the Pixel 2, which looked great, but the notch of this thing in the bottom bar was completely outdated. They could have a phone that has a notch and no bar at the bottom, or have, equal bezels on the top and bottom like the Galaxy S9, but the design of this thing was very, very strange, and it's probably the main reason why nobody wants to buy it anymore. Now we do have a 6.3-inch OLED display, 1440p, and the panel itself wasn't that bad. I'm still kind of a fan of the way this panel is. It's not an ugly panel, but again, when you look at the bottom bar and you look at the notch, it's pretty hard to pretty much recommend this phone anymore with the device that looks like this. It's almost like having as big of a bezels as the iPhone SE. It's kind of the same thing in my opinion. Now we do have a USB Type-C port on the bottom, which was great. We also have, the poly, and we also have the aluminum frame, which is great, and we had kind of like a glass back too, which was cool. And overall, when I held this phone in my hand, it felt like a very premium phone. It doesn't feel like a cheap phone, but definitely the iPhone XS of that time and the Galaxy S9 of that time definitely felt more premium in my opinion. Now we do have IP certification on this thing too, which is always good to see, and we actually did have wireless charging too, which was really, really cool. But again, when I look at the design of the Pixel 2 XL, Google did a tremendous job, and it's very rare that we see phone manufacturers as big as Google, with their Pixel lineup, kind of make a humongous downgrade in terms of the build quality and the design. I don't understand how the design of this phone even came out past, the first initial phases. It looks like a bad sketch, and I can't believe they actually made a phone like this, to be honest. Now we do have, the camera setup on this thing. Now a big thing to keep in mind is that Google, at this time, their Pixel lineup was known as, being probably one of the best cameras of that time, and the original Pixel was rated as one of the best. I think the Pixel 2 and 2 XL were also up there as well. With the Pixel 3 XL in particular, this was a very interesting phone because it had a dual camera setup on the front, it had a single camera setup on the back. So we had a 12.2 megapixel wide angle lens on the back, we had a dual camera setup on the front, so a wide and an ultra wide sensor. Both 8 megapixel lenses there. Now we can do 1080p on the front, but we can only do 4K at 30 on the back. Now at this point, we could have already been doing 4K at 60 on the back of the iPhones for quite a few generations, and even with Samsungs we had 4K at 60 for, a couple of different models that they had to, and the Samsung Galaxy Note 8 came out, or the Note 9 came out this year as well on the Samsung, on this year as well, and that was a very, very good looking phone. So with something like the Pixel 3 XL, for it to have this type of camera setup, and for, one of its main features are stock Android and its camera setup, and for it to look like this, was actually pretty insane in my opinion. No 4K at 60 and only a single lens, when we had phones like the Note 9 that had a dual camera setup, we had phones like the S9 Plus that had a dual camera setup, and we had iPhones, like the XS that had dual camera setup too. So it was already kind of, an outdated camera when it first came out. Now I will still say the quality isn't bad, it's definitely a good quality camera, but I definitely do think out of most of the 2018 phones, this thing has aged probably the worse in my opinion. I think the iPhone XR, even though the camera setup on that thing wasn't amazing, it still, held up way better than the Pixel 3 XL. So in terms of the camera setup, I will give it, still a good score on the camera, but it could have been better, especially when you look at the competition. Now in terms of software, this is probably its #1 saving grace. This thing does have, it started off with Android 9. It is still supported with software, which is great. It's gotten Android 12. I think it's getting Android 13, but I could be totally wrong. But with something like the Pixel 3 XL, you have a long future ahead of it, even outside of its standard custom support, because you do have custom ROM support with this device. So this is another pretty big advantage with something like the Google Pixel 3 XL. You can easily go ahead and make this thing last almost as long as you want it to. As long as there's people developing ROMs for it, you should be okay for the most part. And that is one of the best advantages with something like the Pixel 3 XL. You can easily go ahead and have this thing last as long as you want it to, as long as you're willing to custom ROM your device. If you're willing to root it and custom ROM it, you should be okay. If you're not comfortable with that, then you may want to go ahead and pick up something else. But in my opinion, this is not a bad, situation for this type of device, in my opinion. Now, in terms of the actual performance of this phone, we did have that Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset inside. We had an Adreno 630 GPU, but we had 4 gigabytes of RAM on both models of this specific phone. Now, we did have a base model of 64 gigs, but we had a top tier model of 128. Now, Google still kind of does the same thing, and it is kind of annoying. I wish they could just, expand the storage a little bit more like a lot of other manufacturers had, but I will tell you the performance of this phone is still actually pretty good. It's not a bad performing phone by any means, and I would definitely say if you're willing to go and just, kind of be okay with a little bit of an older or maybe slower performing phone, I would say this is about in line with something like a Samsung Galaxy S9. However, I would expect that phone to probably be a little bit slower because of One UI, because this thing doesn't have a lot of crazy stuff going on in the background. I think this is pretty okay for the most part. But with something like the Pixel 3 XL, if you're playing, basic games, if you're going up a notch, no pun intended, and you're, playing heavier intensive games and you're multitasking and all that stuff, I mean, this is going to be perfectly fine for the most part, unless you're going through and trying to play like the heaviest of heavy games. If you're playing Genshin Impact on the highest settings, it's going to be slow, it's going to overheat, and it's not going to give you that great of an experience compared to if you have the latest generation. But that's expected. When you have the Pixel 3 XL, it's not going to be the best performing phone of all time anymore because it is, 4 years old. So I definitely do think the design can be deceiving. It's not a bad performing phone. It wasn't a bad performing phone when it first came out, but I do think the design didn't really help it in my opinion. So in terms of performance, that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of the actual battery life, this thing actually had a pretty big size battery, a 3430 milliamp hour battery, and I definitely don't think that's a bad size battery to have on a device either. I think if you're going to go ahead and pick up a phone, well, this is not a bad option, in terms of battery life, and this was one of the first Pixels to have wireless charging finally. We did eventually kind of keep it on all the other phones since then, but I'm glad Google kind of kept it at this rate, and I will say the battery life is probably one of the better things about this specific phone in my opinion. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, I'll probably tell you the Pixel 3 XL is probably not worth it in my opinion in this day and age. I would highly recommend buying something like the Google Pixel 5. That is a much better phone than this thing. It's a little bit more expensive, but it is also used. It's now an older phone as well. It's about 2 years old right now, almost 2 years old. So you can pick that thing up for, a little bit cheaper nowadays than it was before, but that is a much better phone than this thing. I think the only reason I would recommend buying this phone is if it's extremely cheap, if it's in your budget, or if it's like the only phone you can find around you, then by all means go for it. If not, I would highly recommend buying something like the Pixel 5. The Pixel 6s are definitely worth the money in my opinion, but I just wouldn't probably recommend buying the Pixel 3 XL anymore. I mean, it was a dated phone when it first came out, and it's only been even more dated since then. So that's kind of how I would sum up this whole entire video, to be completely honest. If you have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section as well. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.